Hi there, this is the third episode of Ukraine Talks, a weekly podcast by Euromaidan Press, in which two Kyiv-based Ukrainian journalists, Ivan Verstyuk and Serge Havrylets, discuss the latest developments in and around Ukraine and try to give you a bigger picture of what's going on. Before we dive into the topics we want to talk about in more detail, let's first briefly summarize what happened over the past week. People should not ask Ukrainians when the war will end. They better ask themselves why Russia is still able to continue it. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said during the Munich Security Conference. On February 20, 10 years ago, Russia began the invasion of Ukraine, occupying and annexing Crimea in southern part of the country. Ukraine destroyed 8 Russian aircraft within 1 week. On February 17, Ukraine took down 2 Su-35 fighter jets and 1 Su-34 fighter jet. On February 18, 1 Su-34. On February 19, 1 Su-34 and 1 Su-35. On February 21, 1 Su-34 fighter jet was taken down. And finally, on February 23, an A-50 radar plane was destroyed. Russians executed Ukrainian prisoners of war in 2 different parts of the front line. The footage of these war crimes was recorded by Ukrainian recon drones. Russian defector pilot Maxim Kuzminov, who landed a Russian military helicopter in Ukraine in 2023, was killed in Spain. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius said that Russia could attack NATO countries in 5-8 years. Ukrainian documentary 20 Days in Mariupol won a BAFTA award as the best documentary film. Denmark signed a long-term security agreement with Ukraine during the visit of the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen to Ukraine. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that Ukraine has the right to self-defense, including hitting targets inside Russia with F-16 fighter jets. The UK government announced over 50 new sanctions targeting Russia's war efforts, including Russian munitions manufacturers, diamond and oil traders. Latvia has become the first EU country to ban imports of agricultural products from Russia and Belarus. Iran has supplied Russia with about 400 ballistic missiles with a 700-kilometer range and plans new supplies, according to Reuters. Sky News has discovered that Russia is importing British high-tech equipment and components through third countries, despite Western sanctions. The U.S. Senate Majority Leader representing the Democratic Party, Chuck Schumer, visited Ukraine on February 23rd to hold talks with President Volodymyr Zelensky about the needed weapons. The USA unveiled over 500 new sanctions against Russia. The European Union adopted the 13th package of sanctions against Russia, taking aim at Russian military supply chains in third countries like China and Turkey, sanctioning 27 companies that directly support Russia's military and industrial complex. The UK committed $311 million to boost Ukraine's artillery ammunition reserves. British billionaire Richard Branson has pledged assistance to help rebuild Ukraine's battle-damaged aerospace industry as part of post-war reconstruction efforts. 68% of Russians support the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, according to VTSIOM, a Russian public opinion research center. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and the Prime Minister of Belgium, Alexander De Croo, visited Kyiv on February 24 on the second anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine signed bilateral security agreements with Italy and Canada. On February 24, Ukrainian kamikaze drones attacked the Novolipetsk metallurgical plant in western Russia. This plant supplies steel alloys and rolled products to Russian defense companies, which produce ballistic and cruise missiles. Thousands of people in the USA and several European countries held rallies to mark the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24. And, to be honest, I was touched to see thousands of people take to the streets of their cities in many countries, from Berlin and Prague to London, Stockholm, and Washington, D.C., with Ukrainian flags in their hands. Apparently, some of them could be Ukrainian refugees, but many others must have been locals, which demonstrates that after 2 years of war in Europe, the Ukraine fatigue has not turned into apathy. This is very important because Ukraine needs support to repel the Russian invasion. Russia's war against Ukraine reminds me of the biblical battle between David and Goliath, but with drones instead of stones. And we don't know yet if the story has the same ending. I want to say a big thank you to everyone who keeps standing with Ukraine. At the same time, only 10% of Europeans believe that Ukraine can win this war, according to the polls, while the latest polls show that the vast majority of Ukrainians believe that Ukraine can win the war against Russia. Ivan, what do you think about it?
Yeah, it's very interesting how the sociology that we see here in Ukraine, it doesn't really show any real fatigue that Ukrainians are having. Still, 73% of Ukrainians say that they're prepared to live with the war around for as long as it takes. However, it would be interesting to notice that the local Ukrainian demand for diplomatic resolution or any sort of diplomatic track to end the war has been growing. Yet in 2022, this demand stood at 59%, while since December, it's been at 72%. So, like 72% of Ukrainians do think that not only weapons, but also diplomacy should be something that our government should be using to end the war in Ukraine's interests. Well, that's very interesting logic, right? If you took at the European poll, take a look at European polls conducted by YouGov, you see that Europeans mostly believe that Ukraine has no chances to win the war militarily. Only 10% of Europeans think Ukraine is able to, while 37% of them think that the diplomacy and the compromise should end the war. Well, if the Europeans, it looks logical. They don't think Ukraine will win militarily. That's why Ukraine needs diplomacy. Here it's different. It's not that Ukrainians do not believe in the capacities of the Ukrainian army, is that Ukrainians do not want to see any more human losses during the war. So when we see this growing demand for our diplomacy to be more active in finding resolution to ongoing war, that's exactly the demand for not losing more people. And in Europe, there was still an idea that the trading territories could be possible to end the war. Some people think that Ukraine should give up on Crimea or it should give up on Donetsk and Luhansk and end the war this way. If you say that in Ukraine, you will be breaking the law because Ukrainian constitution adopted yet in 1996, it directly mentions the number of territories that make our country. So there is no just even legal framework to discuss trading any territories to end the war. So we're not even having this discussion here. And one more thing, it's that Ukrainians, they do really want to end this war faster, and they are prepared to use whatever it takes approach, whatever it takes methods to end the war. By expressing support for the diplomatic solution, Ukrainian society is requesting from our government to find that solution. People do not know what that solution should look like. That's why we have professional diplomats in the government to find that solution. Because economically the war has been hard. I just give you the two figures. Ukraine's job market lost 30% of its jobs. 3.5 million workplaces have been lost due to the Russian invasion, and another loss is educational, where 900,000 kids have to study online instead of attending schools, and which is why these kids are 1.5 year behind the educational program. So that's the more the war takes, the bigger this gap in economy, labor market, and education is going to be. So the growing demand of Ukrainians to resolve the war diplomatically reflects exactly these two things. We don't want any more losses, and we want to the war to be ended as soon as possible. Now, let me ask you this, Sergei. Why do you think Europeans are pessimistic about Ukraine's chances to win the war militarily? What could be standing behind this logic?
I think that the Ukrainian counteroffensive last year that didn't yield any results that we all expected. Ukrainian army didn't manage to sever this so-called land bridge from Russia to Crimea, didn't expel Russian troops from the southern part of Ukraine, and to be honest, didn't advance much. And after everybody saw that the Russian army is not that weak and can actually repel Ukrainian counteroffensive, everybody realized in Ukraine and in Western Europe, I think, that this war is going to be a long war of attrition, and we may not see the end of it even in 2 or 3 years. We all know that Ukraine is a small country. It's 28 times smaller than Russia. And in terms of population, Ukraine is also not that big compared to Russia. And a lot of people left Ukraine as refugees. Women with kids are separated from their husbands. Many of them are at the front lines right now. So we all see how hard it is for Ukraine to deal with this invasion. So I don't think that those Europeans who do not believe in the victory over Russia are not supporting Ukraine. I think that they're skeptical about the Ukrainian ability to defeat Russia militarily because the military potential of these countries, Ukraine and Russia, is different, and Russia has the upper hand. And we understand that the main goal of Russia is to destroy the Ukrainian state. Russia may not be able to achieve this goal, but it is able to prolong this war for many years. That's why we see these polls in Europe. And as to Ukrainians, I'm looking at this sociological poll by the Ukrainian non-governmental polling organization Razumkov Center, and I have noticed that although Ukrainians are actually quite optimistic and believe that Ukraine still can win this war against Russia, they're pretty divided in their views on what is considered a victory over Russia. And 38% of respondents said that the victory for Ukraine would be the expulsion of Russian troops from the entire territory of Ukraine and the complete restoration of the Ukrainian national borders as of January 2014, before Russia occupied Crimea, parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And 27% of people considered the destruction of the Russian army and the promotion of an uprising, disintegration within Russia to be a victory for Ukraine, which I think is unrealistic. So Ukrainians keep fighting. We know that this is a genocidal invasion, and if Russia occupies more territories, more people will have to leave their homes. And so we got no other choice but resist. So that's pretty much the secret behind this high rate of optimism among Ukrainians. But we, of course, are all tired of this invasion.
Let me add a couple of things. I think the basic explanation for why some people in European countries like Hungary, Greece, Italy, and Austria are losing faith in Ukraine's capacity to win this war is that, like, if this war would be winnable for Ukraine, then Ukraine would have won by now. But as we've seen, the whole framework for understanding the nature of current warfare, contemporary warfare that stands behind even NATO's strategic planning has failed in Ukraine. Original planning for Ukraine's war was that it would be a guerrilla type war, or with Ukrainian volunteers hiding somewhere in the woods with charismatic leaders and fighting with a Molotov cocktails. So that was the original NATO expectation, what the war would look like. Well, the current war, current Russian invasion of Ukraine has broken all the plans and all the expectation what this war should be looking like. Well, and we see now that many things that we were expecting and that we were planning. The war stayed largely outside our plans and expectations. And we've got several opinions on what Ukraine should be doing next. And I'll just say that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he wants to have a large counteroffensive operation this year. On the other hand, Ukrainian intelligence, it rather counts on doing most of the offensive work next year. While still, lots of diplomacy is being done. Ukraine has signed security guarantee agreements with its big partners like Germany, Britain, France, and most recently yesterday with Italy and Canada, and with Denmark on the eve of that. So after we strengthen our diplomatic position with the new military supplies on the other hand, and with the new security agreements on the other hand, I think Ukrainian government will be able to proceed to some form of negotiations, which would include presence of Russians in some way. So I think we should prepare for more diplomacy this year, and this is something inevitable. It doesn't mean we are prepared for painful compromises like giving up on our territories, or especially giving up on our people. This doesn't mean it. Just that being prepared for diplomacy means that you're having a goodwill to end the war and that you value people. So that's the Ukrainian position. We value people, and that's why eliminating 400,000 Russian soldiers is not a goal in this war for us. It's a way of fighting. If the bloodshed could be over tomorrow, we'd be happy. But we will still have Ukrainian constitution that tell us which territories belong to Ukraine. I think that's very important for us.
I don't know. It's hard to say what the European expectations are about this war, but of course, Ukrainians know perfectly well that it's not even about territories, it's about the people, about those Ukrainians who are stuck in the occupied territories under the Russian rule. And Ukraine is a democratic country, and Russia is a totalitarian state. And people in Ukraine, they got used to basic human rights, freedom of speech, the stuff which is rare in Russia, which is non-existent. And we all know that Russia persecutes Ukrainians for their position. Those who want to just stay Ukrainian, speak Ukrainian language, they are perceived as the enemies of Russia. Russia wants to erase Ukrainian identity, culture, language, and that's what they are doing in the occupied territories. When Ukrainians are talking about the liberation of Ukrainian territories, it's not just about the constitution. I think it's about the solidarity with other Ukrainians who remain in the occupied territories. And I think that actually, even if Ukraine liberates all the territories within its international borders, it wouldn't be the end of this war, because Russia still can attack Ukraine. The fighting will continue. I think that it will stop only when Russia runs out of resources in terms of military equipment, because they have a lot of people willing to fight for the money. They sign contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry and participate in this invasion. So this is not a big deal for the Russian political and military leadership to mobilize more people, but they have problems with the stockpiles of this Soviet-era military equipment, the tanks, armored vehicles, artillery systems. These stockpiles are not infinite. So we don't know how long Russia can sustain this high level of casualties and losses of military equipment in Ukraine. Maybe we're talking about 2 years or more, but when Russia has no resources to continue this war, it will not abandon its goals. So Russia may be willing to have some armistice, something like that, a temporary peace between Ukraine and Russia to prepare another invasion. So if Ukraine is not allowed to join NATO, another war would be just a matter of time. And I'm not sure that people in Europe understand that, but here people in Ukraine, they understand that pretty well, I think. So let's talk about Donald Trump's vice president picks. Last week, Donald Trump announced the short list of 6 vice presidential candidates, and all of them oppose or question the US military aid to Ukraine. To what extent do they reflect Trump's own position on Ukraine, in your opinion, Ivan?
That's very interesting. I especially noticed how Trump's choice for vice president differs from the choice he was making in 2016. Now he has, well, the most well-known are Ron DeSantis, Florida governor, and then he has Vivek Ramaswamy, who is like a biotechnology entrepreneur that no one really knew about before he started campaigning. And in 2016, Trump had Mike Pence, a much more conventional conservative politician. So it looks like Trump's gonna be even more radical in his next presidential term, if he's gonna get it, than he used to be in his first presidential term. In the first term, Mike Pence was somewhat like balancing Trump's emotions, Trump's radicalism, and Trump's willingness to look for quick and easy solutions to problems that are big, huge, and hard, like economic competition with China. And we still had a war in Ukraine, war against Russian invasion, which was of lesser scale back then, but still Russia annexed almost 20% of Ukraine's territories by then. And we wanted Trump administration to be helpful us on this. Trump did agree to supply javelins for the needs of Ukrainian army, but still he didn't have any strategy for Ukraine. This time, his team is even less likely to have any consistent strategy in Ukraine, since both DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy during the campaigning and their public appearance, they would treat the Ukraine's war as not as a priority for the American foreign policy, but rather one of the issues where it completely disagrees with Europe. And I mean, Trump's America is largely thinks that America should step back in Ukraine and just let Europe do the job. And what's interesting, I paid attention. Anne Applebaum had made really important statement this week when she was asked about what future presidency of Trump would mean for the whole world, for Ukraine, for Europe. Anne Applebaum, who is a well-known historian, she wrote several books on Soviet Union and Ukraine. So she said that Trump is not only going to be an isolationist, he's going to be an anti-European politician, where he would put Europe, Ukraine included, not only in a more dangerous situation and with the military threats coming from Russia and other places, but also in a much more damaging economic situation, where America would see Europe as a competitor, not as a partner and as an ally. Well, and then it's really important who the vice president in the United States is. I'll just give you one example. A week ago, when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was visiting Munich Security Conference, he wanted to see what's next and what Ukraine can do to get the further funding from the U.S. Congress. The bill has been laying in Congress for many more weeks now, and we still aren't getting those $60 billion that we need to purchase more artillery shells and more weapons for the Ukrainian army on the front lines. So the crisis was probably at its all-time low during the Munich Security Conference, and it was American Vice President Kamala Harris who came to talk to Zelensky personally at this really hard time when the U.S. administration in Washington, D.C. is overwhelmed with all kinds of problems which go beyond Ukraine's war. It's also Iranian-backed Houthis in the Middle East, then also Israel-Palestine issue and China and many other things. So I wouldn't underestimate the importance of who's going to be Donald Trump's next vice president, since while getting someone to a position of vice president means that that person is, has a presidential style and could in the future become U.S. president. And when we see Vivek Ramaswamy, who calls Ukraine's President Zelensky a beggar in cargo pants, I don't think that the U.S. president that is able to be helpful to Ukraine and is able just even to spend time on learning more about Ukraine and about Ukraine's history and while Ukraine is fighting this war. I think we should just hope that we'll hope that at least someone more conventional with better expertise in foreign affairs will be included into the Trump's team. Otherwise, it's going to be a disaster. Do you share my alarmism, Sergey?
Actually, yeah, I'm quite pessimistic about the Donald Trump's policy on Ukraine if he returns to the White House, because I think that his vice presidential picks reflect his own position on Ukraine regarding the Russian-Ukrainian war, and we have to look at the names. So the list of vice presidential candidates includes three of Trump's former rivals in the Republican primaries. As you mentioned, one of them is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Another one is Senator of South Carolina, Tim Scott. The other one is Ramaswamy. Other potential candidates include South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, U.S. House member Byron Donalds, and former House member Tulsi Gabbard, who left the Democratic Party in 2022. Ramaswamy ran for president but dropped out and supported Trump. And during his presidential campaign, he actually slandered Ukrainian president and accused him of being a Nazi. He also stated that he would recognize the Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine as Russian, block Ukraine's accession to NATO, and lift all sanctions against Russia. And as to DeSantis, in March 2023, he called Russian President Vladimir Putin a war criminal, condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but a week after, he was criticized for remarks that appeared to advocate a reduction in U.S. military support for Ukraine. Ron DeSantis also ran for U.S. president, but dropped out and endorsed Donald Trump. As to Tim Scott, in October 2023, he said that he would not support a request from President Biden to package aid for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, and funding for border security, even though he has endorsed U.S. spending for each of those purposes. When Russia invaded Crimea and southern Ukraine in 2014, Kristi Noem, then a Republican senator from South Dakota, said that the U.S. had to be united in the face of a Russian invasion, but later she changed her position regarding Ukraine. In March 2023, Noem described America's military aid to Ukraine as a costly strategic mistake, end of quote. Noem has also repeatedly said that U.S. President Joe Biden may have wanted Putin to invade Ukraine. As to Republican Byron Donalds, in September 2023, he said that the House of Representatives has no money for Ukraine. Byron Donalds voted in the House against American aid to Ukraine. Speaking on the Russia-Ukraine war, Tulsi Gabbard said that Ukraine is not worthy of protection because it is not a democracy. So this is pretty worrying, and it doesn't mean that any one of these six names would actually become a vice president if Trump gets reelected. But this is pretty telling. Their position on Ukraine, I mean, is anti-Ukraine, to be honest. And if this reflects the position of Donald Trump regarding Ukraine, so Ukraine is in big trouble. Although Donald Trump promised to resolve the situation with the war in Ukraine very quickly, he said that he will end this war in 24 hours. I still think that it will be something that that will suit Russia. That would be a deal between Trump and Putin, and it would have nothing to do with the Ukrainian interests. So I don't know. We will see. Trump is not a president yet. So if he becomes a president, he may change his position on Ukraine, but right now I don't see him as a friend of Ukraine, actually.
Well, let me add something to what you've been saying. Within the Republican candidates, it's Nikki Haley, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, that's considered to be most pro-Ukrainian. She's very vocal on Ukraine issue, and probably in each of her public appearances, she reminds Americans and her supporters that why it's in America's interests to support the Ukrainian fight against the Russian invasion. While neither DeSantis nor Ramaswamy have been saying anything that they even understand how important is Ukraine's fight. DeSantis mostly, he wouldn't even want to comment anything on Ukraine. Like to him, this is not such a big issue. Not such a big issue is it's also for his voters, uh, as he's seeking for a different role for America on the global scale. And to me, honestly, it feels like if Trump is gonna be working on on and getting this degree of polarization within the Republican Party itself, then he might break up the party into two parts. You see the distance between Nikki Haley and Trump and his vice president and his vice presidential picks on Ukraine is huge. I think you had that degree of polarization in American politics yet in the Civil War era in 1860s, and we see same thing now. So it's whether Trump or Ukraine, sort of the dilemma, and it looks like it from here. And then also the future of the Republican Party, I think, is at high risk if the Trump's camp is going to take over it. We will not see healthy American conservatives and healthy American involvement in global affairs and global problems in wars for a liberal world order anymore. So that's why it matters a lot. And I think most of the Ukrainians are following the U.S. presidential election quite closely, which hasn't been usually the case. But now we're like to us, it's like 50% of Ukraine's potential success in the war depends on who's going to be American ex-president and also vice president.
And we should not forget about Trump's controversial statements on NATO. It's not only about Ukraine; it's about the European security, which looks like Donald Trump doesn't care about. We should remember that he questioned the need for American intervention in a war in Europe if Russia attacks NATO countries. So let's actually talk about NATO. And we all know that the current NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg, will soon be stepping down after nearly a decade of service, and his term will be officially up on October the 1st, 2024. So pretty soon he will be out. And there are several candidates for this job right now. Currently, Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, Latvian Foreign Minister Krišjānis Kariņš, and outgoing Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte all openly want this job. Other candidates include the President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen, the Prime Minister of Denmark Mette Frederiksen, and the ex-UK Defence Minister Ben Wallace. Who will be the next NATO Secretary General, in your opinion, Ivan?
Well, the most likely candidate as of now is probably Mark Rutte, Prime Minister of the Netherlands. But to be honest with all of you, Rutte will be just the another version of Stoltenberg, current Secretary General. Rutte won't be changing much in how NATO works, I think. So those who support Rutte, those are mostly, conservatives. He's supported by Americans. He's liked by Joe Biden, U.S. president. He is supported by Brits. By supporting Dutch prime minister for the position of head of NATO, they support, NATO of being a club for the rich countries that largely stays outside the real wars and stays outside the military conflicts going on the borders of NATO countries. So by picking Rutte, NATO chooses not to engage in any of the active wars in the nearest future. While after having 2 years of war in Ukraine, we now having lots of conclusions about how aggressive and how creative in its aggression countries like Russia might be. So the strategy of avoiding the wars could is won't lead NATO to keep its balance of security neither in Europe nor anywhere in the world. That's why to Ukraine, a much better candidate would be, for instance, Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, who is totally different from Rutte and many things. But the most important are two. Kaja Kallas she believes that the NATO should be expanding, accepting new members like Ukraine and also like Georgia or like Moldova, another country that is desperately seeking for security solutions too, since Russian army has base in eastern Moldova. So, and besides expansion of NATO, Kaja Kallas she thinks that NATO should be prepared to have boots on the ground. That the NATO shouldn't just be a club of the rich countries who do not want to fight real wars. That it should be bloc that would be providing direct military support, including troops, to countries that are either NATO members or NATO allies, like Ukraine is. And somewhere in the middle between Rutte, who is about preserving what NATO is now, and Kallas, who wants to relaunch NATO. We have several other candidates. Ursula von der Leyen, she's very experienced in the security matters since before she became president of the European Commission. She served as Germany's defense minister. So while Rutte has no such experience, he's rather like a professional political manager. Von der Leyen is much more competent on security matters, but herself she rather prefers to have another term at the head of the European Commission. But also, what's interesting is von der Leyen thinks that European Union should create its own layer of defense, which would have defense budget for the whole European Union, which might have troops like something we can call like European Union Army, though this is work in progress. And also, she wants much bigger procurements of weapons in the European unions, where the EU would be guaranteeing the amount of defense solution and technological solutions and all kinds of weapons to be procured annually, with jobs being created in the European Union. So that's where we get actually some sort of competition in the defense manufacturing between EU and America. And there has been a statement from Stoltenberg, the current NATO Secretary General, that he worries that now the EU will be competing with NATO for defense spending of the European countries. But other candidates like Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen or former British Defense Minister Ben Wallace, they have their own advantages. While Frederiksen, she could be seen as rather a new generation of European politicians who are coming from Nordic Europe, which has better economies and higher standards of living than in Eastern Europe, but still prepared to be radical and prepared to be helpful to the Eastern Europe. While Ben Wallace is he is what's important, his bread. And for the NATO he could contribute British expertise on navy, which is really important, especially if America steps back in supporting NATO operations in Europe, while in the British expertise in organizing the naval warfare could be critical. I'll give you just an example from Ukraine's war against Russia. One of the biggest wins of Ukraine is keeping the western part of the Black Sea relatively safe, where we are able to do exporting of our goods from Odessa and several other ports in southern Ukraine. And that's a Navy operation, right? Where we have to use the sea drones to keep that area safe, where we have to prepare our anti-ship response capacity. And that matters for the future of how wars are going to be fought, because sea blocking is killing countries, exports and also imports. So this is Ben Wallace's could be his potential biggest input into into the future of NATO. And there will be this big summit by the NATO countries in Washington D.C. in June, where it will be deciding the candidate, the who among the candidates is going to be Secretary General of NATO. And by this decision, NATO members will be also deciding future of Ukraine, right? Because if that's a choice between Mark Rutte and Kaya Kallas, well, that's pretty obvious. Rutte is probably not going to let Ukraine into the NATO soon. He's going to be helpful to Ukraine, but he's not, from my point of view, he's not prepared to accept Ukraine into the NATO until the war is over. While Kaya Kallas is a totally different, where she would agree to accept an Ukrainian into the NATO. So by deciding who's going to lead the NATO, it's future of Ukraine, but also future of other countries like Georgia and Moldova, for at least, because those are small countries that wouldn't be able to defend themselves from any aggression, especially from the Russian aggression outside NATO and outside like bigger circle of NATO partners and NATO allies. And of course, here in Ukraine, we're following closely who's going to lead the NATO, and after living through 2 years of war, it seems to me that Eastern Europe should have a chance to be represented at the level of NATO leadership. This could be Kallas from Estonia. This could be Foreign Minister of Latvia. Also, the President of Romania, Klaus Iohannis, is also mentioned among the candidates. I think because Eastern Europe has so many experienced in in reforms, in post-Soviet transformation, in fighting for its rights, political and economical, against the Moscow influence. So this is exactly the right time to let Eastern Europe to lead the NATO. Well, the Eastern European politicians are not trusted as much as Western European, because here in Eastern Europe, probably they are more radical on Russia, more hawkish on Russia, and less prepared to do any sort of compromises. But it's the right time to have a more decisive NATO, I think, than just doing all the best to keep it outside any wars and outside any real fighting. Vladimir Putin, he clearly understands that the fighting conventional war isn't a popular idea within any of the rich nations. And if he is noticing that vulnerability within the NATO strategy and within the NATO logic, you may be sure he will be using this. He will be showing that NATO is weak because it doesn't want to fight the war, and Russia strong because it wants to fight the war. Though, of course, fighting the war to redraw borders in the 21st century seems horrible, useless, pointless, and lawless idea. But that's the Putin's thinking. And let me ask you, Sergey. Well, as I've said, I do not think that Mark Rutte of Netherlands is the best choice for the NATO Secretary General. Do you agree, or do you think that I'm too pessimistic on Rutte?
The NATO Secretary General can't make any decisions alone. It is obvious, and all decisions in NATO are made by consensus of all allies. Of course, a NATO Secretary General is an important post. The good thing is that unlike Donald Trump's vice presidential picks, all of the candidates for this post are pro-Ukraine. They actually support Ukraine in many ways. For instance, Mark Rutte was the prime minister when the Netherlands decided to give Ukraine F-16 fighter jets. Kaja Kallas is the prime minister of a country that actually spends the largest share of GDP on assistance to Ukraine among all NATO members. And she understands well what threat Russia is, because Estonia has actually the border with Russia. So I think Kaja Kallas understands pretty well the challenges to the European security and the security of all NATO members. As to the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she actually spends so much time in Ukraine. She visits Ukraine so often that sometimes you don't even notice that she left. So she is 100% pro-Ukraine, and she believes in democratic values. And I think someone who has this kind of attitude towards the Russian aggression, which violates the international order, human rights, and strives to destroy a democratic sovereign state. I mean, someone who understands all these challenges is a pretty good candidate for this job. And as to the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, she's pretty good at making the alliances, coalitions, and actually Denmark is a part of the F-16 coalition, of the artillery coalition. Denmark gave Ukraine all of its self-propelled Caesar howitzers. I mean, Mette Frederiksen is the one who knows how to communicate her ideas, how to negotiate important issues. And she is actually 100% pro-Ukraine. The same goes to ex-UK Defense Minister Ben Wallace. He was the one who gave Ukraine a lot of modern weapons like anti-ship missiles and a lot more. So I think that there is nothing we have to worry about when Jens Stoltenberg leaves his post, because anyone who will come and get this job will understand the challenges that all NATO members face today. Okay, let's talk about China and its role in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba and the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a conversation in Munich during the Munich Security Conference. How do you assess Chinese position regarding the Russian-Ukrainian war? Do you think that China is a neutral player, or it actually aligns with Russia?
That's a very interesting question. Well, I would point to the vocabulary that China is officially using for describing Ukraine-Russia war. In the official statements, it's called Ukraine crisis. So China doesn't even recognize this to be a war because in the Russian official vocabulary, it doesn't recognize what's happening in war too. In Russian vocabulary, this is special military operation, and China has, somewhat to subscribe to, Russian terminology on this, and they call it Ukraine crisis. That probably tells you what kind of neutrality China is having. It's officially it's neutral on the conflict and doesn't support either side. And let me quote you Xi Jinping, Chinese president. I have his book called Governance of China. Just a couple of sentences that describes Chinese military policy. So that's what Xi Jinping is writing. The Chinese people cherish peace. We will not engage in aggression or expansion. But then he adds, we must fully implement the strategy of strengthening the military with science and technology, the essence of which is innovation. End of the quote. So we may be pretty sure that Chinese generals and Chinese military analysts are paying huge attention to Ukraine-Russia war because they want to keep their own army technologically updated. Well, and also they're interested, of course, in Russian army's experience that was gained in the combat zones all over Ukraine. And that's why Chinese military is probably seeking for ways to learn from Russian army, and they are able to do joint training sessions. And then, China is a country that in its foreign policy, it just hasn't been noticing Ukraine. So the meeting that Ukraine's foreign minister Dmytro Kuleba had with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi a week ago in Munich, it's really important. Russians hate the idea of Ukraine finding common language with China. Our government has long been seeking ways to establish a dialogue with China because we do think that the Chinese diplomacy doesn't understand Ukraine, its history, its foreign policy, what we think about geopolitical balance, security balance in Eastern Europe, and we need to just dialogue to explain Chinese our version, the Ukrainian version of what's happening. So this China is usually slow on making any big shifts in foreign policy, but that's the start. That's a very good start that we're having an official dialogue with China. Because Russians, not only they hate it, they think that's this is a risk for them. Because if you read Russian media, while according to Russian media, China is like biggest partner of Russia and completely supports Russian invasion into Ukraine to build a new global world order where China and Russia would be leading at least over half of this world, with it being an alternative to the Western capitalism and Western liberal rule-based order. And they think that we're having official dialogue with China now kind of ruins that illusion that Russian media has been creating. Also, even the European Union, it had to introduce sanctions for the first time against China. While EU has been having very complicated policy in China where it would restrict Chinese investments into the European Union. So EU is pretty much aware that Chinese expansion could not be done militarily because Xi Jinping says he doesn't want to expand. The Chinese expansion could be done by economic methods. So the EU is having somewhat, very very, I'd say, rigorous policy on China. So it introduced sanctions against several Chinese companies that were supplying goods of military use for the Russian needs. And also we have evidence from the media. It's been reported by Nikkei, a media company, that private companies in China, they would buy the spare parts for tanks and sell them to Russians. So there was like a supply chain going from China to Russia. And the Chinese view of this is like this, come on, this is private sector activity. We can't do much about this. It's not like the Chinese government or Chinese army is selling directly anything to Russia. It's the private sector first. And if it's been sold something like a wheel, you can't say this is a weapon, right? A wheel is a wheel. It's a dual-use product. You may put this wheel on a military vehicle. You can put this in a private car. So that's kind of excuses that China is using. We need to stop this. It's really hard to break all these supply lines going to Russia. And it's been a huge problem for the EU, where it would keep sanctioning companies, entities, and organizations and private individuals who do supplies, military supplies for the Russian army. But Russians, they keep creating new companies registered elsewhere, everywhere, that do continue doing the supplies. So hitting particular companies is is can only get you so far. We need to be like much more systemic solution at how we block any imports of anything that could be used in Russian tanks or howitzers or artillery or jets or anywhere or vessels with imported parts imported from elsewhere. And well, the other thing is that after Russia was cut from the global financial system, the most popular foreign currency in Russia now is Chinese yuan, Chinese currency. It's traded on the Moscow Stock Exchange, and Russian central bank directly buy the Chinese currency from Chinese central bank if that's needed. They have a special like swap line for this. And that's where the the core Chinese interests lies. It's they want to have yuan, Chinese currency, playing a much bigger role and being an alternative to both U.S. dollar and the euro, the European currency. And Russia is probably the first relatively big economy that subscribes to using Chinese currency for foreign trade. And that's probably something we should be paying bigger attention to, because as long as Russia has its access to any of the foreign currencies that it's able to pay for imported goods, it's going to be doing the import that would strengthen its army. So it's our Ukraine's role to talk to China and try to explain to Chinese politicians that Russia shouldn't be their ally, shouldn't be their partner, neither economic nor military nor political, and that being partners with Ukraine is in China's interest. That's a complicated dialogue. I don't expect to be quick, to bear results in a month, but we should be doing this because even if it's hard even to say that China is going to be Ukraine's ally in this war, too early for this, of course. But we can even shift what Chinese neutrality on this looks like. This neutrality still could be more pro-Russian and could be more pro-Ukrainian. So we want Chinese neutrality to be pro-Ukrainian, where it would cut anything that would support Russian invasion into Ukraine, even if it's just private sector activity and not the Chinese government participating in this. Do you think that it's realistically to get Chinese policy more pro-Ukrainian in the midterm, at least?
China will never be Ukraine's ally. This is just impossible due to several reasons. First is that with every day of this war, Russia gets weaker and weaker. Russia is cut off from Western markets and its dependency on China is growing. So China is actually interested in the prolongation of this war because it only strengthens its ties with Russia. And the second thing is that both China and Russia are authoritarian states. It's only natural for authoritarian states to flock together. Although the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba during their meeting in Munich that China does not sell lethal weapons to Russia. I don't buy it, actually. Of course, you mentioned this, that China sells dual purpose goods to Russia, which Russia can use to produce weapons. And China is well aware of the fact that Russia is using these goods for its military-industrial complex. But there are also interesting figures that I want to mention. An American economist, Robin Brooks, published a chart that shows China's exports of transportation equipment to Russia, and they are up 800% since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. So China is far from being a neutral country in this war. It is actually a Russian ally, and another reason why China will never be a Ukrainian partner is because if Ukraine wins this war, Ukraine will integrate into the West. It's just a matter of time when Ukraine becomes a member of NATO and European Union. And for China, it is easier to deal with the countries like Russia or Belarus, where China can promote corruption, use it, take advantage of it, and so if Ukraine gets occupied by Russia, it will be more beneficial to China because Russia is already a close ally of China, and so the Ukrainian market will be accessible to China. So that's why China will never be a Ukrainian ally, but of course they will never admit that. What do you think about it? Do you agree with it?
I think China just isn't seeing Ukraine's global role and doesn't understand this. Chinese strategic thinking and foreign policy usually is about paying attention only to large countries with large economies and large armies. So their geopolitical math is, well, Russia has bigger GDP, Russia has buying more Chinese goods. Russia's having bigger army, so that's why probably we should be rather pro-Russian in our neutrality. Let's put it in parentheses probably. So Ukraine should just tell our part of the story. And what I want to add, once before the war, I attended a reception organized by the Chinese embassy in Kyiv. China has quite a big embassy in Kiev, and this reception it was devoted to Chinese Independence Day, and I was surprised by how many diplomats actually work at Chinese embassy. I've been to lots of diplomatic receptions in Kiev with various European embassies, with US embassies, and pretty much know the number of diplomats working at particular embassies. So China, compared to Europe, has huge embassy in Kiev, and I wonder what are all those people doing here, right? Because Chinese ambassador in Kiev, he's usually very silent, never comments anything for the media, and never goes public. You hardly ever you able to find a photo of him on the internet. But China still employs lots of people. That means those are like analysts, probably, who are deployed here to do work. Probably they're not deployed here to go to restaurants. They do something. And if China has such big personnel at the embassy, I think they all now having a job to analyze the war, of course, from all sides: economic, military, technological, diplomatic, anything, domestic policy. And also, it's still it's about, I hope that China will be making efforts to understand Ukraine better. We don't know, of course, what Chinese ambassador tells his supervisors back in Beijing, but what would be necessary for Ukraine is that the Chinese government would understand that we want changes in our bilateral relationship with China, which have been non-existent for decades. We start a serious conversation with China just on the eve of war. We haven't had an ambassador to China for a long time. Something needs to be done because, if you think of this, if Russia won't be able to get anything from China, neither foreign currency, nor any goods, nor weapons, nor anything, then it will affect Russian economy and Russian army drastically. Chinese support is still something that keeps Russian economy healthy, running, and even growing, while it provides, the technological solutions like microchips. Well, Vladimir Putin says that Russia is going to deploy artificial intelligence be used by drones and other weapon systems. For that, he needs microchips. And China is the only place that he can get those microchips. This is not like science fiction. Artificial intelligence is already on the battlefields to some degree. Besides microchips, China is able of solutions for their electronic warfare, which could also be sold as a software, which wouldn't be categorized as weapons. So this is something that may be sold on a commercial basis. That's why it's extremely important to cut the Russia-China business ties. It's hard and it's unrealistic to cut it quickly and at 100%. to China on this. Well, and the good argument is that unlike Russia, China is very integrated into the global economy. So any sanctions, serious sanctions of the scale that Russia is having, would kill Chinese economy. And that's the argument for why China can't go too far in supporting Russia, because any big package of sanctions would undermine Chinese economy to a degree where it would start breaking here and there in various regions of China, which is a very big country. So China is not Russia. You can't analyze Chinese foreign policy by the patterns that you analyze Russian foreign policy. And to conclude all this, I think Ukraine-China dialogue should have started much earlier, and maybe at this point, well, we could still, ask Chinese for humanitarian assistance. Not only weapons that we need in Ukraine, but we need, demining systems. We need the help for internally displaced persons. We need all kind of, technological solutions for emergency services that save people. China could be helpful on those. If they say that they, support any like humanitarian values and human rights, Ukraine could get something from China on this too. China, I'd say that the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who met our Foreign Minister Kuleb, he's rather hardliner, but still he is. He is balanced by Xi Jinping, who is comparatively liberal Chinese communist. We need to do more, and hopefully, this Chinese direction of Ukraine's foreign policy will bear some results through the course of this year. I might be over optimistic about possible successes of Ukraine's diplomacy on China, but that's because I do think that so far China just doesn't understand Ukraine, and as long as it's gonna get vision of what Ukraine wants and what kind of country it wants, China will change its strategy in Eastern Europe. Well, that's my view. Do you think I'm being over optimistic on this?
Yeah, I think you're too optimistic, because for China, the relationships with Russia are way more important than relationships with Ukraine. So this is a top priority for them, in my opinion. And unfortunately, by the way, China is not the only country where Russia can get microchips from, because Russia successfully circumvents the Western sanctions and imports high-tech equipment and components from the West using third countries, including China, by the way. As to China's position regarding the Russian-Ukrainian war, China is really careful. Of course, they don't want to have any problems with sanctions, but we should all remember that back in 2023, the Chinese Foreign Ministry published a peace proposal to resolve Russia's war against Ukraine, and that proposal included just general phrases and calls for negotiations, and Ukraine criticized that plan. And in the spring of 2023, the Chinese envoy, a special representative for Eurasian affairs, Li Hui, toured European capitals to promote China's peace plan for Ukraine, calling for an immediate ceasefire, which would leave Russia in possession of the occupied territories of Ukraine. And now Wang Yi stressed China's position on the Ukrainian crisis, as they call it, emphasizing that China is committed to a political solution to hotspot issues, advocating for peace and refraining from selling lethal weapons to Russia. But we all know that Russia gets a lot of goods from China, and these goods are dual-purpose goods, of course, and it's hard to actually punish China for this cooperation. But still, I think that China will continue to be careful, and on the other hand, will continue to support Russia politically and economically, because it's a natural ally of a country like China, which is also an authoritarian country, and China understands Russia way better than it will ever understand Ukraine, in my opinion. Okay, so we had such a long conversation today. Thank you, Ivan, for your time, and thank you, everyone, for being with us today. Please follow Euromaidan Press on social media, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow Ivan Verstyuk's social media accounts. You will find a lot of interesting stuff there too. Details are in the comment section below this podcast.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
See ya!